Hello everyone, it's HockeyXchange here, and welcome back to the channel that talks about everyday hockey. The anticipation is here. This video will be a continuation of my previous video of NHL defunct teams. If you haven't seen it yet, you can start with this video as canonically, this is where the league first began. Now enough stalling, let's get into the video. The history of the NHL as we've known was a lot different from today's game. Before we get into the players, let's learn about the NHL landscape at that time. From a period of 1917 to 1967, a total of 15 teams existed and played at least 1 year in the NHL. As time came and went, teams either were relocated to another city or eventually fell into financial problems and ceased to operate ever again. In the end, 9 different teams came and went, with the last team to cease operations in 1942. Of the 15 teams, only 6 will make it to today's game. It wasn't until 1967 was when the NHL would bring new teams into the league. Today, we'll be going over the 9 franchises and the last player from each of these teams and see how their careers have turned out. Now keep in mind, there is not a lot of information on some of these players as media was scarce during the early 20th century, so I do apologize if there's a lack of info. If there's any additional information I missed about these players and or these teams, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And with that, I hope you enjoy. Let's begin with the first team to have dissolved in NHL history. The Montreal Wanderers began as an amateur ice hockey team that would later turn professional once they began play in the National Hockey Association. They briefly played in the NHL in its inaugural season of the 1917-18 season, where the organization would only play 6 games when a fire broke out and burned their arena to the ground. Without any funding and already having financial problems, the team would fold and their players would be dispatched to other teams. The last player to have stepped onto NHL ice was a player named Jerry Jaran, who played in the NHL for 2 seasons in his entire career. He is mostly well known as the first American-born player to ever play in the NHL and was also part of the first Ice Hockey Olympics in 1920, playing for Team USA and winning a silver medal. After several years playing in other hockey leagues, he would return to the NHL in the 1925-26 season, playing for the Boston Bruins. He would also become the first American-born player to score an NHL goal. In his entire career in the NHL, he would only record 5 goals and 1 assist, a total of 37 games. All of those points came in the last season that he would play. His last game would be on March 16, 1926. The Quebec Bulldogs were a hockey club that began in 1878, becoming one of the first ice hockey teams established in ice hockey history. The club continued to rise up the ranks and eventually became a pro team in the National Hockey Association in 1910, and eventually the NHL. The team would unfortunately last 1 season in the NHL before they were relocated to Hamilton to become the Hamilton Tigers. Dave Ritchie was a hockey player playing in the NHL for 3 years, becoming a star in his final season there before the change to the NHL. He is the first player in NHL history to have scored a goal on December 19, 1917 as a member of the Montreal Wanderers playing a game against the Toronto Arenas. Unfortunately, his career in the NHL wasn't as successful as his time in the NHA, having 2 stints in the NHL and only playing a handful of games. His last game would come on January 23, 1926, becoming the last active member to have played for the Quebec Bulldogs. The Hamilton Tigers were a team inherited by the Quebec Bulldogs and played from 1920 to 1925. They were a team that only had 1 successful year, which was unfortunately in their final year in the league. During the final season, there were tensions with the Tigers players and their general manager. They were paid only a certain amount and refused to pay their players. Thus began the first players' strike in NHL history. This resulted in the franchise's dissolution, and the players' contracts were sold to a new expansion team, the New York Americans. Harry Birch, or more well known as Billy Birch, was an American-born player in the National Hockey League, making his debut in January 1923, finishing off his last 10 games with 9 points. His rise to become a superstar would come the following season, where he would score 22 points in 24 games. In only his 3rd season, he would win the Hart Trophy as the league's most valuable player. That would be the same year that the Hamilton Tigers would hold the first players' strike. Billy would follow the team to New York and became part of history as the first New York Americans player to score a goal. In the 1926-27 season, he would win the Lady Byng Trophy as the player to have exhibited the best type of sportsmanship and gentlemanly-like conduct. His career would continue up until the 1932-33 season. In 1974, he was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. He was one of the best hockey players of his time, being in the top 10 in scoring 4 times in his 11-year career. The Pittsburgh Pirates became the 7th team to join the NHL, as well as the league's 3rd US-based team, founded from 1925 all the way to 1930. The team would have a successful first season, maintaining a winning record, but there was no success in the playoffs. The next 4 years would find the Pirates with little to no success, with the last season being one of the worst seasons to date. The financial crash of 1929 would lead to the death of the franchise. 1 year later, the team would relocate to become the Philadelphia Quakers. The last player to have played for the Pittsburgh Pirates is Cliff Barton. He began his NHL career playing in the last season of the Pittsburgh Pirates before their relocation to Philadelphia. After 2 seasons in the NHL, he would be back in the minor leagues for 9 years until, when playing for the New York Rangers minor league team, he was called up to play 3 games in the 1939-1940 season, but unfortunately did not record any points. He would spend the rest of his career in the minors until his retirement in 1944. Not a memorable career to say the least, but you can definitely say he stuck around long enough to get another shot in the NHL, and no one could take that away from him. The Philadelphia Quakers unfortunately don't have a lot in their history, as they only lasted 1 year as a team. They had an inaugural season, finishing with 4 wins in 44 games. This ranks them as having the 2nd worst record in NHL history by win percentage. It came to a surprise that this player once played for this team. Introducing Sid Howe. Fans of his will know him as a Detroit Red Wing and as one of the top players of his time, winning 3 Stanley Cups with the Red Wings. But what you may not know was that his career began in a completely different way. His debut came in the 1929 season, debuting with the Ottawa Senators. That next year, he was loaned to the Philadelphia Quakers for their only season in the NHL, then played for the Toronto Maple Leafs when the Senators ceased operations during the 1930-31 season, returned to the Senators for another 2 years, then with the St. Louis Eagles when the Senators relocated, and then finally, staying put with his last team with the Detroit Red Wings, where the rest is history. It seemed like every year he was playing for another city for that first 5 years, but this didn't hinder the young Howe, as his career only began after settling in Detroit, arguably as one of the best players during his time, with his highest tally with 60 points in 48 games. He would play a total of 12 years with the Red Wings and retired from the game in 1946. Some notable achievements from his time in the NHL were the 3 Stanley Cups as stated before, and was one of 8 players to have scored more than 6 goals in 1 game. In 1965, he was inducted to the Hockey Hall of Fame. Before we had the current incarnation of the Ottawa Senators, they were the original Ottawa Senators, founded before the birth of the NHL in 1883. The club would join the NHL in 1917 as one of the original 4 teams to play in the NHL's first season. The organization found huge success during their time competing for the Stanley Cup both in the NHA and the NHL, winning a total of 11 championships from 1903 to 1927. The Ottawa Senators would unfortunately fold as the club struggled to have funds and was in major debt, and in 1934 was sold and relocated to St. Louis, where they became the St. Louis Eagles. Frank Hollett, also known as Flash Hollett, was one of the first offensive defensemen of his day, making his debut as a Maple Leaf in the 1934-35 season, but finished that year being loaned to the Senators. It wasn't until he went to Boston where he would become an NHL superstar defenseman. He was playing during a time where defensemen were not point producers and that the league only had a 50-game schedule at most. He played for 8 seasons in Boston, contributing to the Bruins Stanley Cup championships in 1939 and 1941. In 1942, he set a record for goals by a defenseman with 19 goals. In the 1944-45 season, he would break his own goals record with 20 goals and scoring 41 points in 50 games, playing with the Detroit Red Wings. This record would stand for a quarter of a century before being surpassed by Bobby Orr. Pollitt would retire from the NHL after 13 seasons, scoring 132 goals and 181 assists for 313 points. At the time of his retirement, he was the highest scoring defenseman in league history, won 2 Stanley Cups, was a 2-time All-Star, was in top 5 with goals and assists and points for 2 seasons. At the time, the Norris Trophy for the best defenseman wasn't around yet, so imagine how many more trophies he could have won. The St. Louis Eagles were a team inherited by the Ottawa Senators that played from 1917 to 1934. The first year of the Eagles was also the last, as the team struggled to gain traction with fans and a losing record. What hit the team with financial troubles the worst were the travel costs, as they were playing in the Canadian division and travel expenses became way too much. After that, the team would fold and cease to exist. Bill Cowley was described as the Wayne Gretzky of his era. He began his NHL career as a St. Louis Eagle. Once the team folded, he went to play with the Boston Bruins. He would eventually break out as a superstar player in his second season in the league. In 1939, he would break an NHL record for the most assists with 34 in 34 games. That same season would also see him break through the playoffs, leading his team with points. He would also set a new NHL record with 64 points in a 48-game season, winning the Hart Trophy as MVP. Throughout his playing career, he would have amazing statistical point-per-game percentages, but was derailed by injuries. In his final season in the league, he would become the all-time points leader in the NHL, surpassing Sid Howe. Upon his retirement, he led the league in assists and points from 1944 to 1952, with a total of 354 assists and 549 points. He won 2 Hart Trophies, 2 Stanley Cups, was a 5-time All-Star, led the league in assists per game 5 times and points per game 4 times. His 1944 record of nearly 2 points per game stood from 1944 up until 1981, when a young player of Wayne Gretzky was the first person to break that record. Bill Cowley would be inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1968, and to this day is still considered one of the greatest players of his time. The Montreal Maroons played in the NHL starting in 1924, winning a Stanley Cup in 1926 and 1935. But due to financial difficulties resulting from the Great Depression, led to the suspending play after 1938. Despite efforts to revive the team, the franchise was officially cancelled in 1947, leaving the Canadiens as the sole team in Montreal. They were the last non-Original Six team to have won the Stanley Cup. Herb Cain began his NHL career playing with the Montreal Maroons, being a top contributor on his team, winning 1 Stanley Cup during his time there. By this time, you may have noticed that many players I've talked about had an all-time record in points during the 1943 and 44 season, and that was because scoring was substantially increased due to players joining World War II. Those who stayed back at home to play in the league saw many of the numbers increase for a short period of time, and Herb was no exception, scoring an all-time high 82 points, surpassing the previous record of 73 points. And like many other players within the following few years, he had a substantial regression from 82 points to 29 points in just 2 years. That same year will also see him be demoted to the minor leagues until his retirement in 1950. He would end his career with 2 Stanley Cups, one with the Maroons and one with the Bruins. Although leading the league in points in the 1943-44 season, there were no trophies awarded at that time besides the MVP. To this day, he is the only player who has led the scoring title that have not been inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. The New York Americans were the 3rd expansion team to join the league along their expansion brothers, the Pittsburgh Pirates. While it was the first team in New York City, the downfall of the Americans began when the New York Rangers arrived, playing under the same roof. It didn't help that the Rangers were the more successful team, winning a Stanley Cup in their second year. The New York Americans found little to no success, often not making the playoffs, but the last straw came after suspending operations in 1942 due to World War II. With the New York Americans now gone, the demise of the club marked the beginning of the NHL's Original Six era. Ken Mosdell not only has the honors as the last member of the New York Americans franchise, but was also the last player until 1967 to play for an NHL team that was not part of the Original Six teams. He started the season where the New York Americans changed their name to the Brooklyn Americans and then signed with the Montreal Canadiens, where he would go on to have a successful career, winning 4 Stanley Cups with the Canadiens. Besides winning 4 Stanley Cups, he had an above-average career playing in 5 All-Star games and being in top 10 scoring 2 times. By the time the 1957 and 58 season would begin, he would only play 2 games, recording 1 assist. That would mark the last time that he would play for an NHL franchise. And there you have it, the conclusion to the last players of defunct or relocated teams. It's interesting to see how long a team's legacy can last through players that played for them. If you haven't already, you can check out my video where I take a look at the NHL's last players from the expansion era. If you enjoy this kind of content and want to watch more, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content. And with that, I hope to see you next time.